Prague, 13th of July, 1419. The air in the new town is thick with the smell of summer and simmering rage. A massive procession, led by the radical priest Jan Hus, halts before the town hall. They demand the release of their imprisoned brethren. The stone is thrown from the window, striking the priest. Instantly, the mob rushes the city hall, and many of the Catholic councillors are violently seized and thrown from the upper windows to be impaled on the backs of the people below. This event marks the beginning of the first Defenestration of Prague. This happens after years of religious and social tension. This defenestration would throw Central Europe into 15 years of fire and blood. A conflict that would pit peasants against knights, gunpowder against plate armor, and the Kingdom of Bohemia against the rest of the empire. Prague, at the turn of the 15th century, was the jewel of the Holy Roman Empire, but beneath the surface, it was bubbling with anger. The Catholic Church owned nearly half of the land in Bohemia, and the high clergy lived like nobles while the peasants struggled. Jan Hus, a brilliant scholar and priest, began preaching at the Bethlehem Chapel. He did something radical. He spoke in the local Czech language instead of Latin. Hus attacked the sale of indulgence, the practice of paying the church to forgive sins, and argued that the Bible, not the Pope, was the ultimate authority. In his work, De Ecclesia, Hus wrote, "A faithful Christian should not believe in the Pope, but in the truths of the Gospels." Not only that, but at the time the Catholic Church was in chaos. The Great Schism saw three different men, all claiming to be the true Pope. Amidst the corruption, Hus preached a return to the true Church. His demands were quite simple. A poverty-stricken clergy, arguing that the Church should be stripped of its vast lands and political power, returning to the humble roots of the apostles. There was also the vernacular, as he preached in Czech, not Latin, making the divine accessible to the common man. And finally, the Utraquist Chalice, the most symbolic of his demands. He demanded that lay people receive both the bread and the wine during communion. For centuries, the wine, the blood of the Christ, was reserved for priests alone. Hus offered the chalice to everyone, asserting that in the eyes of God, the soul of a peasant was equal to that of a bishop. Olivier Marin, in La Réforme commence à Prague, explained that this was a total game changer, because the chalice for the laity meant the end of the sacred barrier between the priest and the faithful. But it wouldn't last. In 1415, Hus was summoned to the Council of Constance under a promise of safe passage. It was a trap. He was declared heretic and burned at the stake. As he died, he reportedly told his executioners that while they were roasting a goose, Hus meaning goose in Czech, a swan would eventually rise that he couldn't silence. When the news of Hus's execution reached Bohemia, the spark ignited. The symbol of the chalice appeared on banners and clothing everywhere. Tension peaked in July 1419. A radical Hussite priest led a massive crowd to the new town hall in Prague to demand the release of Hussite prisoners. When the town council refused, the mob stormed the building and threw the Catholic councillors out of the upper story windows onto the backs of the crowd. This first defenestration of Prague, the first of many, was the point of no return. František Šmahel, in the Hussite revolutions, described this moment as an anomalous rupture in the medieval order, where a society decided to exist entirely outside of the authority of Rome. King Venceslas IV was so terrified by the violence that he suffered a heart attack and died shortly after. The throne passed to his brother Sigismund, the very man who had betrayed Jan Hus at Constance. Sigismund's betrayal of the safe conduct made him the ultimate villain in the eyes of Bohemians. And when he claimed the Bohemian throne, the people of Prague answered that the king who killed the prophet was no king at all. The Bohemians were mostly farmers and lone people, not professional soldiers. They faced the finest knights in Europe. To survive, they needed a miracle, and they found it in Jan Žižka. Žižka was an aging, one-eyed minor noble who realized that if his men couldn't fight like knights, they would make the knights fight on their own terms. He developed the Wagenburg. He took heavy farm wagons, reinforced them with thick wooden planks, and equipped them with small cannons and handguns. It was one of the first widespread use of gunpowder in European history. Those handguns were named Pistola, that would give the name Pistolet sometime later. Peter Czorny, in his biography of Jan Žižka, notes that Žižka's genius lay in his discipline. He wrote a strict military code, the Žižka Military Order, stating whether a noble or peasant, anyone who breaks the order of God and the army shall be punished without mercy. And even after losing his second eye, Žižka led his warrior of God through the whole conflict, never losing a battle. When facing the Bohemian, the knights charged, and they found themselves riding into a circle of literal wooden fortresses. They couldn't break the chains between the wagons, and while they struggled, the Hussites picked them off with crossbows and firearms. But apart from the legend of the general, Žižka also carries a background of cruelty. For example, some records tell us that Žižka made a lot of Catholic priests burn alive. This could be explained by the context of the wars, as Žižka was convinced that he was living the end of times and was seeing himself as the instrument of the divine wrath on earth. This is what Czorny does in his biography. He rids Žižka of successive ideological layers, both the Baroque vision, which saw him as a cruel heretic, and the communist vision, which made him a pre-revolutionary people's leader. He portrays him as a man of his time, a minor nobleman from the late Middle Ages, deeply religious, for whom faith and the struggle for God truth were as the absolute center of existence. Between 1420 and 1431, the Pope and the Emperor launched 5 separate crusades against Bohemia. Each one ended in a humiliating disaster for the attackers. The Hussites were so disciplined and their reputation so fearsome that the wars began to be won before a single shot was fired. For example, at the Battle of Domažlice in 1431, a massive Crusader army heard the distant song of the Hussites singing their war hymn, accompanied by the rhythmic creaking of hundreds of wagons. The psychological impact was so great that the Crusaders panicked and fled the field, leaving behind their supplies, cannons, and their dignity. František Šmahel described this era as an anomaly, a moment where a peasant army became the most professional military force in the world. Success, however, bred internal discord. The Hussite movement wasn't a monolith. It was a fragile alliance of 2 radically different visions. In the south, the radical founded the city of Tabor. They took the equality before God idea to the extreme, creating a society with no taxes, no nobility, and no private property. They placed a large barrel at the city gates where everyone had to deposit their gold to be shared equally. Thomas Fudge, in The Magnificent Ride, described this as a radical attempt at an apostolic life, where people believed they were purging the world for the return of Christ. This radicalism eventually terrified the moderate Hussite nobles, who realized that the Taborites were just as much a threat to their status as the Pope was. Thus, they formed the Utraquists, primarily made of the nobility and the wealthy burghers of Prague. They wanted the 4 Articles of Prague, but they still believed in the feudal order. They wanted to negotiate with the empire and the return to a reformed normalcy. By 1434, Bohemia was exhausted. To end the war, the moderate Hussites made a deal with the Catholic Church. At the Battle of Lipany, the moderates turned on the radicals in a brutal civil war. The radicals were crushed, but the victory forced the Church to sign the Compactata of Basel at Iglau in 1436. For the first time, a heretical group was officially allowed to exist. Bohemia became the first land of 2 religions. As Olivier Marin concludes, Prague was the laboratory of the modern world, proving that freedom of conscience could be won, despite the huge cost for the Kingdom of Bohemia. For 100 years, Bohemia remained the heretical island in the Catholic See. When Martin Luther nailed his thesis on the door in 1517, he famously declared, "We are all Hussites," without knowing it. As Olivier Marin notes in La Réforme commence à Prague, the Hussite experience serves as the laboratory for the Great Reformation. It proved that a national church could survive excommunication and crusades. However, after the Battle of the White Mountain in 1620, the Catholics regained control, and Jan Hus was officially rebranded as the villain for nearly 2 centuries. Everything changed in the national revival of the 19th century. Czech historians, led by František Palacký, stopped looking at the Hussites as religious rebels and started seeing them as democratic heroes fighting German oppression. The Hussite Wars became the golden age of the Czech spirit, and Jan Žižka was no longer just a general, he became the symbol of Czech strength. This was the period where the Hussite myth was fully constructed. This was less about the Bible and more about the Czech language and independence. This is why you see, nowadays, massive statues of Jan Hus and Jan Žižka in Prague, considered as the founding father of a nation that didn't have a state yet. And in the 20th century, the story took another strange turn. When the communists took power in Czechoslovakia after World War II, they loved the Hussites, but for a different reason. They ignored the part of the religion and focused solely on the city of Tabor. They claimed that Jan Žižka was a socialist, a hero leading a class war against the wealthy elites. They used the Hussite communal lifestyle in Tabor to justify their own ideology. Today, as Peter Chorney points out in his latest research, we are finally seeing the Hussites for who they really were: complex, deeply religious men of the Middle Ages who accidentally invented the modern world. And in Europa Universalis 5, you can experience the whole series of events by yourself. The most interesting way to play is, obviously, by playing Bohemia. Everything starts after the 1400s. There, you get the first event of a chain, Dr. Jan Hus. The first few events are quite simple. They state who Jan Hus is, and they send him to Constance, where he dies, burned at the stake. And in the same way that it happened in reality, the Bohemians people get furious. The pivotal event is a Jan Zalewski procession and the first defenestration of Prague. This is at this precise moment that you will be able to choose whether or not you convert to Hussitism or stay Catholic. If you convert, you'll gain army morale, monthly religious influence and reduction of war exhaustion. Or, if you remain Catholic, you will lose 50% estate satisfaction. In response, the Papal States will get an event to fight this new heresy. But the malices are so important that the AI will go to war most of the time. And once the event happened, the emperor and every neighboring country that is Catholic and not allied subject or in a truce with Bohemia will receive the choice to ally with the Pope. Luckily, Poland will also receive a similar event, but this time to join the side of Bohemia to gain prestige and stability. During the duration of the situation, Bohemia has two events. The first is a repeatable event with three choices to gain either gold, stability, or population conversion. But at one point, there is also an event to gain Jan Žižka. Despite it not being mentioned in the event, he is available as a general. The first war should look like this, almost alone against the rest of Europe. If you manage to repel the first war, the Papal State will bide its time and get another event once it replenishes its troops to go to war again. This will go on and on until the end of the situation, which can happen in two ways. The first one happens if Bohemia converts back to Catholicism, and the second one if Bohemia holds fast for 30 years. Winning the situation as Bohemia allows you to gain 20 stability, 10 legitimacy, 50 religious influence, and start the last event, the 4 Articles of Prague. This last event allows a final choice. Finally sign the peace and gain a unique government reform, or choose to gain a wartime modifier for 15 years, allowing for more easy conquest. Either in the writings of Martin Luther, the statues in Prague, or in your campaigns of Europa Universalis 5, the Hussite Chalice ended up as a symbol of a little kingdom that said no to the world and won the right to exist by its own rules. Subscribe to the channel to make sure you don't miss any of the upcoming historical documentaries and new features on Europa Universalis 5.